Hello, everyone. It's 12 o'clock, so why don't we go ahead and get started. First of all, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Great River Health for joining us today for the webinar on COVID-19 vaccine do's and don'ts. My name is Kristen Pritchard. I am the Director of Clinic Nursing Operations here at Southeast Iowa Regional Medical Center, and I will be helping facilitate the webinar today. I would like to thank our additional sponsors for promoting the event, Fort Madison Chamber of Commerce, Greater Burlington Partnership, the Keokuk Area Chamber of Commerce, Lee County Economic Development Group, and the Mount Pleasant Chamber of Commerce as well. Thank you so much for helping to get this information out to our community business leaders. Today's webinar is really intended to provide you information on the COVID-19 vaccine and what you need to know as an employer or as a business owner. And we would like to start with some opening remarks from Dr. Michael McCoy. Dr. McCoy is the Chief Medical Officer for Great River Health. So please join me in welcoming Dr. McCoy.
Hello, welcome everyone. As Kristen said, I'm Dr. Michael McCoy and I'm the CMO for the health system, and I'd really just like to welcome you on behalf of Great River Health. COVID-19 has certainly had a profound effect on us all, either personally, socially, mentally, occupationally. And while this has gone on for a year and a half, it is certainly not gone. Within the last week, we've had at least 7 deaths here at the hospital that I'm aware of. We have lost a 49, a 39, and a 28-year-old all this last week to a mostly preventable tragedy. Information is coming fast, it's dynamic, and for some reason, something scientific and biological has become something much more than that. Masks, vaccines, mandates, possible legitimate exemptions, state versus federal, and what that looks like in your businesses. Hopefully some help, guardrails if you wish, that can be put up around do's and don'ts to help us all. So welcome and thanks for attending.
Thank you, Dr. Before I introduce the speaker, Attorney Penelope Phillips, I wanted to remind you that you are muted. So if you have questions during the presentation, please make sure to put them in the chat, and we'll go ahead and address that. Either Penny will look at those and monitor them during her conversation with you all, or we can address them during the question and answer session after Attorney Phillips' presentation. So Attorney Penny Phillips focuses exclusively on counseling and representing employers in all areas of employment and has represented employers for over 30 years. She asked that I keep her introduction brief, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Penny. And I just want to thank everybody for joining, and we hope that this information is what you need to make best decisions for you and your company.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't be in beautiful Southern Iowa right now. I always like coming down your way. I am going to try to share my PowerPoint right now. And let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. I typically have too much material in the PowerPoint, and so I'll try to shorten it. If you'd like a copy of it, you can ask. I'll send it down to Kristen and she can share it with you. But what I really have done is just kind of highlighted the issues surrounding what's going on with the vaccination, mandatory vaccination programs. Excuse me, I may skip around a little bit. And if I do that and it's irritating, I apologize. So right now where we're at is that many employers have mandated that their employees get COVID-19 vaccinations, which has been permitted really for many, not so much COVID, but mandatory influenza vaccines. That's been around for a while. I've certainly worked on this off and on for the last 5 years. So at this point, most of the healthcare systems, at least in Minnesota,
Penny, can you unmute yourself? Your mute button went on somehow.
How strange. I'm sorry. So then on September 9th, we learned from the Biden administration that they were going to implement mandatory vaccinations, or actually soft mandates and hard mandates. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what we know, which is not very much. A soft mandate is not a condition of employment mandate. It is a requirement that employers mandate or ask their employees to get vaccinated. And if they don't get vaccinated, they implement an alternate testing program. We understand from what the Biden administration announced that that is going to apply to employers with more than 100 employees. That's all we know. We don't have any rules. We don't have any regulations. We have some educated guesses, but that's what we know. A hard mandate is what many employers are doing. For example, that's United Airlines, which requires vaccination as a condition of employment unless the employee is granted a religious or medical exemption. And what we know thus far is that the federal government, I'm going to skip ahead here. There's a hard mandate for federal employees and a hard mandate for federal contractors. And that we've got some guiding information about that thus far, but federal contractors have until December 8th to implement a mandatory vaccination program. The program for federal employees is already starting. Then that we also know for healthcare organizations that CMS is going to be requiring COVID-19 vaccination for workers in most healthcare settings. And we still, again, we don't have all the information about that, but that's why you'll see a lot of health systems already starting to kind of ramp up to adopt that rule. I have a list here of the things we don't know. We don't have the rules yet. We can only guess. We know that the OSHA rules for any employer with over 100 employees is going to be challenged right away. And my guess is that the mandatory vaccination program for federal contractors will as well. Even if the mandatory rules are challenged, quite certainly the softer mandate, which is less obtrusive for employees, will likely be challenged as well. Okay, so does anybody have any questions here before I go on here? I'm at a disadvantage in that it's difficult for me to see the chat because I'm only working off of one monitor. So Kristen, do we have any questions?
Not so far.
Okay, so I should have warned you. I know there's a lot of people in the group and you were supposed to ask questions in advance. We got one question. I have done hundreds, if not thousands of seminars in my years of practice, and it is really boring if I just talk the whole time. So please ask questions because we're really here to answer. I'm here to answer your questions. All right, so here are the vaccine policy considerations: mandatory, non-mandatory. Obviously, for those of you who have less than 100 employees, unless you're a federal contractor or you're in healthcare, you are going to be free to mandate a vaccine or not mandate a vaccine. I don't expect the state of Iowa is going to mandate. So I think that you can adopt you could adopt a soft mandate where you have testing in lieu of a mandate. You have to consider, everybody's going to have to consider if you are covered by Biden or if you choose to voluntarily adopt a policy, the scope of the policy. You are required to offer reasonable accommodation, which I'll talk about in just a second. If you have labor unions, you have to negotiate with the union about adopting and implementing a policy. There's workers' comp issues in Iowa, as in Minnesota. If you mandate a vaccine and somebody has an adverse effect, pretty likely it'll be covered as a comp event under Iowa's workers' compensation statute. And then you've got vaccine incentives. So I just popped up here some sample language of a policy that I created about a sample mandatory policy, which outlines getting a vaccine as a condition of employment and defines what it means to be fully vaccinated. You probably maybe read in the paper that I think United was going to terminate some pilots who refused to get vaccinated. I saw yesterday in the paper an anesthesiologist that was being, I don't know if you saw it, Dr. McCoy, on the news, being escorted out of UCLA because he refused to get a vaccination. But basically a mandatory vaccination policy puts the employer in a position of doing something with the employee if they don't get vaccinated and they don't otherwise have an exemption. What that do something is, there's a lot of discretion. All right, so here's the exemption. This is the do's and don'ts, or at least part of it. Under federal law, under state law, really every state in the country, an employee would be eligible to be exempt from any mandatory employer policy if the employee had a disability as defined by federal or state law, or they had a sincerely held religious belief. So a sample policy should make sure that, or if you're communicating with your employees, you need to make sure that they understand that medical and religious exemption requests will be honored. So you have a statement that in your policy that that's what you're going to do. All right. So again, any questions? Otherwise, I'm just going to plow ahead here.
There was one question about access to the PowerPoint, and I think that we will be able to share that along with the video for the presentation.
Yes, I will send you the PowerPoint.
Yep.
All right. So again, we're talking about this on a really high level. Medical exemption process is effectively what the American with Disabilities Act or applicable state law would define as a reasonable accommodation. So if an employee has a medical condition that typically that's contraindicated, or that it's contraindicated to get the vaccination or some other reason to be exempt, they can apply for a medical exemption. It is the way that I've seen them. This is sort of all started 15 years ago with Johns Hopkins adopting mandatory influenza policies, creating forms where people could apply for an exemption. So you have an application form, and this is just one way of doing it. It's not the way of doing it. In fact, please don't just take this and use it. There's many different ways to request medical exemption information, but you essentially are asking your employees to justify why medically they should not receive a COVID-19 vaccination. There's a part that's filled out by the employee. I think this is important, a part where the employee is asked to verify the truthfulness and accuracy of their medical condition. I didn't include the second part of this form, which is a statement to the employee's physician or provider, asking for confirmation of the employee's medical condition, as well as a recommendation that the employee not get the COVID-19 vaccine. And I mean, that is in a nutshell the process, but I am way oversimplifying it. So for example, some of the things that I've had to work with clients on, and I know the folks that at the hospital system will understand this, is that, you know, if you, the employer, HR, or are requesting medical information from an employee, you've got to make sure that you keep that information confidential, kept in a separate file apart from the employee's personnel record. The biggest challenge when employers have been required to offer a medical exemption is who decides, who reviews the documentation, and who decides whether or not the employee is in fact eligible for an exemption. Larger organizations have a medical exemption review committee that reviews the medical exemption requests and decides whether or not the employees submitted sufficient information to be eligible for a request. But that's not easy to do, particularly if you're a smaller employer. I mean, I'm not a doctor. I don't, if I'm working with a non-healthcare related client, I certainly have questions about what is and isn't a reason for an exemption. The CDC, of course, has a list of medical conditions that would say that you shouldn't get the vaccine, but that doesn't stop an employee from asking for one anyways. The much harder exemption process, in my view, is the religious exemption process. And under the Title VII, as well as Iowa state law and the law of every state in the country, employees are entitled to be relieved of the imposition of a mandatory policy based on a sincerely held religious belief, unless exemption from the policy, and this is also true for disability, would create an undue hardship. So a similar process is followed for employers who are mandating a vaccine for employees that have a sincerely held religious belief. But unlike a disability or a medical condition, what is and is not a sincerely held religious belief is not readily an objective standard. Should I pause now and are there questions?
Yes, there's been a couple. I think you kind of got into the religious exemption, but one of the questions was what exactly constitutes a religious exemption?
Am I allowed to chuckle cynically in response to that question? I don't know there. I do know actually. It is very challenging. So here, and I'll just give you a little setup of what the problem is. So the definition of religion under federal law, and most states follow federal law, is incredibly broad. It is not limited to a particular well-organized religion. And in fact, just by way of example, many years ago, I had a case where an employee who was an atheist claimed a religious made a religious discrimination claim, and something like an atheist could be covered under religion, which is very counterintuitive. Recently, there was a case from the Midwest or from Ohio, I think, where an employee who was a vegan was challenging getting a mandatory influenza vaccine, and that was recognized as a religion. So it's a broad. It could be a lot of different things. It has to be an organized, not organized. It has to be belief in something higher, a spiritual belief system, not moral, not ethical, not political, definitely. But it is not clearly defined. There is also, I'll just add to make it more confusing, or more challenging for us lawyers, there's a little bit of a conflict between what the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission says is a religion versus what the courts are saying is a religion. And so there's some tension there between those two bodies. I mean, the courts always win, but if you have some employee file a charge of discrimination with the EEOC, they may take a broader view of what's religion than the federal courts do. And I'll just say, based on, I am in the process, or I have been for the last 3 years, litigating a large number of religious exemption claims. And that's exactly what the EEOC has done. They've said, all you have to do to be exempt under from a mandatory flu vaccination is offer a religious belief. My body is a temple, or I follow scripture XYZ, which says that I can't allow anything in my body to change the course of God's will. Therefore, I don't want to have a COVID-19 vaccination. The EEOC, at least a few years ago, would say something like that would be a sincerely held religious belief. That was a really long answer. I'm sorry about that. Don't you just hate lawyers? They just keep talking and talking and talking.
No, you're good. You're good.
All right.
There's been a couple of questions about testing, so I thought I'd just address both of them at the same time.
Okay.
Can an employee ever be exempt from the testing process if they don't get vaccinated? And then also, if employers require testing for non-vaccinated employees, does the employer have to pay for that test?
Yes, I anticipated that question. So I think that, let me just say that who pays for it is not clear. Under the federal mandate, the federal employee mandate, the employer pays for it. I think that's what I'm going to guess that's what's going to be required for anybody who's subject to a mandated policy. I know we're all talking about that sort of generally. Iowa, like Minnesota, has a tricky little law that makes it less clear as well whether or not you could shift the costs to the employee. So I think I would be careful about charging the employee for that test. Now, I suppose if it was a completely voluntary policy and you could work around the Iowa statute, then maybe you could shift some of the cost, or at least a copay cost, to an employee. But I think I would assume it's going to be covered by the employer. And then what was the first question?
Can an employee ever be exempt not to test?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I just got asked that question the other day. I know under the OSHA emergency temporary standards for healthcare employers that there is a exception to testing based on a religious belief. And when I first saw it in a policy, I thought, oh, this can't be right. This is nobody. That I apologize if I sound disrespectful. This can't be right. Nobody can be exempt from testing on a religious basis, but it's in the rules. So yes, somebody could be exempt from testing, but as an employer, if you had an employee who was both exempt from getting the vaccine and then refused to test, I think you'd have a pretty good undue hardship, safety threat argument, depending on what the employee's job was. I mean, it would certainly be risky to have them in in your business around a lot of other people, etc. Great question. Thank you. Anybody else?
I've got a couple more questions in here.
Good.
For a small business with multiple branches, where each branch is less than 100 employees, is the overall business considered a covered employer within the ETS?
Well, great question. And your question, though, illustrates the problem that we're in right now. We don't know because we don't have the rules. So that's the big problem. I will guess, because that's been asked a lot of times, given what the public policy is behind mandatory vaccinations or soft vaccines and testing, I would say they're going to define employer as broadly as possible, right? So if you're a small, let's just say you're a retail store and you've got, three different, a retail operation, you've got 3 different stores in 3 different counties, they're going to aggregate those numbers to try to reach the maximum amount of people possible, right? Because the Biden administration wants people to be vaccinated. And one way to do that is to define it employer broadly. So that's my best guess, but we won't know until we get the rules.
And then the last question I think so far is, this may be related to exemption forms, but let's see. Sorry, I lost it. Can you do a medical cert form to a medical provider like FMLA, or should you? Does that context make sense?
Yes, it
Okay.
does. I wouldn't do that because you're not getting at what the real question is. A medical cert form is just whether or not somebody has a serious health condition that incapacitates them from work, which is a different standard than whether or not somebody has a medical condition that would preclude them from getting a vaccine. And I know with healthcare clients where I sort of have been going around a little bit is unsurprisingly, all the providers that are on the medical exemption committee are taking the CDC's contraindication list very seriously and not allowing anybody who has a medical condition that's not on that list to have an exemption. And so I would just I would think the FMLA form isn't going to give you an answer to the question that you really need. But it's a great question.
There's more questions that have come in, so.
Oh, big surprise. See, I just needed to get you all going.
Yes. Is there a deadline by CMS for healthcare to be vaccinated, and how will this be monitored by CMS?
You know, don't you love it when a lawyer just says beats me? Really, I wish I knew. I think that this is part of the frustration is we're just not getting real-time information. So federal contractors have December 8th working backwards. We don't know what the CMS rules are. I will note it. I represent a lot of healthcare institutions, and there was an enormous amount of frustration because the emergency temporary standards from OSHA that related to healthcare came out, I don't know, 16 months after the pandemic started. So we didn't get those rules until what, June 2021. And by that point, everybody had already really, had instituted very careful procedures, so we don't know. I mean, I think they've got to come out with them soon if they want to have a realistic, well, I guess I shouldn't speak because I'm not, again, I'm not a medical professional, but I would expect them to come out as soon as possible. We did hear that OSHA was surprised by the fact that they were going to have to do mandatory or do the over 100 employees. CMS has known about this for a lot longer.
What if wide-scale testing is not available in your area, or at least at the weekly frequency? Would showing effort to acquire tests show enough due diligence?
Well, again, now you're probably wondering, like, what do we know? Well, we don't know very much. We hope so. There is a testing shortage. I know the FDA just approved another testing method yesterday. I think that this is another area where the Biden administration is trying to do what they can to get more tests out there, because more testing gives you more information.
And there's a couple of questions about remote employees or employees that work from home. So if you want to just provide some information on what the requirements are for work from home employees, and then if they need to be tested or do they need to be vaccinated if they're coming into the office?
Yeah, well, again, we don't know. Under the federal contractor rules, if somebody is working entirely remotely, I'm just going to double check here because I just printed it out. I think anybody who doesn't ever come into the office doesn't have to be vaccinated, because it defines employee as somebody who comes into the office. So, and we've certainly been recommending that if you're going to mandate the vaccine, that you consider exempting your employees that work from home. I looked at a policy a couple of weeks ago where employees who work remotely were exempt unless they came into the office for, more than, I think, 15 minutes in a 48-hour period, whatever the exposure rules are.
Okay. We are seeing legal challenges with employees with natural immunity, as in the case with, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Zywicki versus George Mason University. Do you see more of these types of legal challenges, and will they establish a precedence?
Great question. Well, I think last week, almost every major health system in Minnesota was sued, not on the natural immunity theory, but just sued for all sorts of alleged violations of the Constitution for adopting a mandatory vaccination policy. I expect this to never end. I know the OSHA ETS, when the OSHA rules come out, they'll be challenged. And I'm sure people are already working on lawsuits because there's a whole constitutional issue about whether or not OSHA has the authority to promulgate rules like that. So I expect legal challenges. What we'll have to see is, well, yeah, two issues related to legal challenges. One, you got to get a judge somewhere to be willing, if you want, if that's sort of where you want to go, to actually declare the rules to not be applicable, right? So you have to do some kind of temporary injunction. That's one way that it could happen. The other thing I think we're all a little worried about is, what happens if you've got a judge in Iowa versus a judge in New York versus a judge in Texas, all coming to different conclusions about whether or not the mandatory vaccination requirements outlined by the Biden administration are not lawful. I mean, we could be subject to different rulings depending upon what state we're in, and really, quite honestly, depending upon whether you're in you're in Des Moines versus in Burlington, if you've got a different judicial district, which I'm sure you do. Wonderful question. Thank you.
And then will employers have to provide the tests, or will employees be able to provide proof that they have gotten tested somewhere else, such as the public health department?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what is the enforceability of it?
Again, to say, I don't know. I don't like saying that, but it's true. I don't know.
What is it, the enforceability of a mandate? Isn't it not considered a law and must be legislated? Was the question.
I don't think so. That may be true for state related entities, or let me put it this way. There's going to be a different standard of lawfulness applied to state actors, but a private employer operating a private business is free to adopt a mandatory vaccination policy or not. There's no requirement under the law that policy be, or that mandate come from legislation, because we get to adopt, our private employers get to adopt rules that they want. They are subject to challenge, of course, constitutional unlawfulness, but basically private employers have that right. That's a really interesting question.
That's it for right now. Maybe there'll be more that come through. Penny.
All right. Well, we're just buzzing through here. All right. So here's just a sample religious exemption request form. The way I already know, because I just this morning got a sample of the federal government's forms. Every time I look at my forms, I find a way that I could tweak it. But basically the question is, please explain in your own words why your religious beliefs and practices prevent you from complying with the required vaccination policy. Identify your specific religious beliefs or membership in a church or religious body that prevents you from receiving it. How does getting the vaccine conflict with your religious beliefs? And then this is the question that always gets interesting answers. Have you received other vaccinations? I mean, most people have received measles, mumps, rubella, etc. Please explain how your current religious beliefs or practices prohibit you from receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. And I think, that's an important question. You don't, in order to be eligible for a religious belief, you do not have to submit a statement from your church or your pastor. This was an issue in the case that I've been working on, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's position is that you're not required to, you shouldn't ask employees to submit anything. They certainly are free to do so, but typically it's not been a requirement that that I've seen in various policies. All right. And then again, like with the medical exemption process, you are asking people to affirm that it is a sincerely held religious belief and they provided truthful information. And, you know, I'm just to be perfectly honest, I mean, at this point, everybody knows about that you can get a religious exemption. There is information available on Facebook and all over the place where you can an employee can just go and download a statement and put it on the form. Questions? Anybody? All right.
There was one question that came through, sorry.
Okay.
This is a little bit different question, but do we know if the COVID pay tax credit that employers can get was extended? It was set to expire on September 30th.
I don't believe that it has been extended.
There are many websites showing employees how to complete these forms to obtain exemptions. If it seems to be a canned response, can you deny the request?
Oh, such a good question. I don't think so. I don't. And I think this is the problem with the definition of religion in general. I mean, unless the employee is clearly engaging in behavior that's that's completely the opposite of whatever they're saying in their statement, I think it's really hard to say no if somebody offers a religious belief and offers a justification for not getting the vaccine. What does that mean? That means that there's a lot of people who are going to get exemptions. Is it a risk of harm to you and your business? Possibly. What's the downside of saying no? It's getting sued and it's getting sued by the EEOC or by the employee saying that you denied them what is on its face, apparently a reasonable or sincerely held religious belief.
And then the last question here so far is why are exemptions required? Can an employee simply say they don't want it and have it be their choice?
Great question. Why are exemptions required? Because under federal and state law, anytime somebody has a anytime an employer has a policy or practice, there are two broad categories of protected classes that permit the employee to request that they not be subject to the policy or that the policy be modified in some fashion. So, I mean, that is under the American with Disabilities Act and Title VII. So let me just give you an example. I'll pick hopefully a non-controversial example. So I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, and so I don't want to work on Saturdays. So I ask my employer, who has a policy that everybody has to work every other Saturday. I ask my employer for an exemption to that policy. And assuming it's not an undue hardship, Title VII state law would say I have I'm protected under federal law and state law, and I'm allowed to ask for a reasonable accommodation, and changing that schedule could be a reasonable accommodation. Similar rule for people who have disabilities, that you may have a rule. I'm just trying to think. Nothing is coming to mind, but you have a rule that applies to all employees. You can't bring your own devices to add on to your computer. But I am hard of hearing. And so I've attached an adaptive piece of equipment to my computer or to my stethoscope or whatever the case is, to my phone. So I asked my employer for modification to their policy. So that's a well-established employment practice that the EEOC for years and years and years, and the federal government and the federal courts have all said you have an obligation. I think what the mandatory vaccination policies are trying to get around is people who simply refuse to get vaccinated without having a medical or religious reason. So, and I'm going to say this a little bit differently, and forgive me if this sounds harsh. You are always, an employee is always free for a private employer to refuse to get vaccinated, but an employer is always free to have rules surrounding the consequences of refusing to get vaccinated when the employee is not eligible for a medical or religious exemption. And so for those Delta airline pilots, for that director, that anesthesiologist at UCLA, that may ultimately mean they lose their jobs. But that's permissible, assuming the process for religious and medical exemptions were followed.
What would be the legal justification for an employer to refuse a medical or religious exemption?
So let's just say employee has a medical condition that there's nothing in any of the studies that we know today that say that somebody with that medical condition shouldn't get a vaccine. So the employer decides that the employee is not eligible for a vaccine because their medical condition doesn't say they should be exempt from a vaccine. That would be one. On the religious belief, if I offered, and I've seen a fair number of these, a conscientious objection to getting a vaccine, as opposed to a sincerely held religious belief, that would be a reason to deny a religious request. It was predominantly philosophical, political, moral, or ethical, not spiritual or religious. Great. That's a great question. Anybody else?
I think that kind of answered the last question on here. When would an employee not be eligible for a religious exemption? Are there other situations besides what you just talked through?
Oh, goodness. Yeah. I mean, most of the ones that I've reviewed have been eligible. And if the employee, I mean, most of the programs that I've been working with have the employee has the right to submit a request for a religious exemption or medical. And then if it's denied, there's an appeal right. So making sure that everybody has kind of their due process before the employer takes action. And I think that's the right thing to do if you're going to fire people who don't get vaccinated. But at the end of the day, and this, forgive me, I'm going to sound a little flip here, but the process, the mandatory COVID vaccine policy is geared towards giving people who have a legitimate reason for an exemption. And for those that don't have a legitimate reason, for example, they don't like to be bossed around. They think Bill Gates has something to do with the COVID vaccine. People who believe that, they don't fall into any protected class. And so they're the ones that I think at the end of the day, the mandatory vaccination policies are sort of geared to get at. We've already sort of talked about this telecommuting. If you, the employer, are mandating get somebody getting a vaccination and they go during ordinary business hours, that's probably compensable time. We talked about the Iowa statute not being able to shift the costs of employer required testing on employees. Again, we don't know what the scope of that is. It is if you have unions, it's a mandatory subject to bargaining. Workers' comp, it likely is. If it's mandated, the employee gets a severe reaction from getting the COVID-19 vaccination, it's likely covered by workers' comp. And then I just added here a couple of quick slides from the EEOC because I understood that was sort of part of what I was talking about. But this today is just the clear statement from the agency that's responsible for enforcing the anti-discrimination laws. And that is under the ADA, Title VII, and other federal employment non-discrimination laws. May an employer require all employees physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19? And of course, they answered it in a typical government fashion, right? They didn't answer it head on, but the federal EEO laws do not prevent an employer from requiring all employees physically entering the workforce place to be vaccinated, subject to the reasonable accommodation provisions of Title VII and the ADA. That's the law. And then finally, what are some examples of reasonable accommodations? So, I mean, this is sort of the part of the question that, or the part of the process that everybody's hasn't really had an opportunity to think about. But so I am an employer. I'm a large employer. I'm subject to a mandatory vaccination program. I have a religious and a medical exemption process, and I've granted employees the opportunity to have a reasonable accommodation by an exemption. What do I do then? And you are going to want to consider the next step. I mean, testing is one option. The other one is, additional masking in healthcare. Employers are making employees who are exempt, they have to wear not only a mask, but a face shield or protective gear and do testing. I mean, there's some flexibility there, but you're not done when you give the exemption or when an employee gets an exemption, because you got to figure out how to protect everybody else, including your customers, if the employee isn't exempt. So that's the end of the PowerPoint.
I had a couple more questions on workers' compensation for a severe reaction. Is there a time frame, 1 day after, 1 week after? And is occupational health going to be available to diagnose as a COVID-19 vaccination reaction? And then when do you put employee on the OSHA log?
Oh, goodness. I just read the OSHA log answer the other day, and I'm sorry, I don't remember what it was. Fairly quickly, I think. You do have to record it on the OSHA log. I don't know about the occupational health question, but I think that you want to, if you have a reasonable basis to believe that your employee has had a reaction to a remember, it's a mandatory COVID vaccine, not one that they just go out and get on their own, then you should turn it over to your comp carrier and let them let the experts deal with it, at least in my view. Because they'll have access to better information. My understanding, and I don't know what's true if it's true in Iowa as well as it is up in Minnesota, but most COVID-19 claims were denied. And I haven't heard of any COVID vaccination claims that have been allowed, but that doesn't mean there haven't been any, but I think the insurance companies, workers' comp companies are looking at those very, very closely. Okay. I see we're out of questions.
Yeah, that looks like the end of the questions.
Okay. Well, we have 10 minutes left, so you can either all go and eat your lunch, or you can ask more questions. Okay. No, crickets.
Well, I think just on behalf of Great River Health, I wanted to thank Attorney Phillips. Thank you, Penny, for coming and presenting information. And I do appreciate everybody's interest in the topic, and I hope that this gives you information that you needed today for your businesses. I know that it's hard, asking Penny questions when we don't have all the final answers. So just keep looking for information to come out. And I know that as final decisions are made, there'll be more guidance. So maybe we can look to do some follow-up, maybe through like a written communication or something that we can get out to people.
Yeah, I can send you, we have a blog that we put out pretty regularly. We try to push out information. I'll try to remember to send you a link to that, or, information, kind of summary of what we know. I mean, we've got some stuff up there about the federal contractor requirement. We haven't said much about the federal employee, but as soon as the OSHA over 100 rules are issued, or the CMS rules, we'll be pushing out information. You are all welcome to. So
There was one final question that came in. Can you legally ask employees if they have been vaccinated?
absolutely. That's been true for months now. Let me tell you what you cannot do. If somebody says no, you should not ask why. And why should you not ask why? Because that is considered to be soliciting disability related information. So it may be that the person says, oh, I can't, if they offer it, don't worry about it. But if somebody says, you say, are you vaccinated? And the applicant or your employee says no, and you say, well, why not? Then they may feel compelled to disclose something about their medical condition in a situation that you really don't want to know about their medical condition. I see here's another really good question. What if an employee lies and you find out? Can you terminate them? I actually think you can. And I think that is this is now, I'm putting on my true 30 plus years of representing employer hat. But what a great message to your employees. If you lie, you're done. You'll do it once and people won't lie again, is my guess. And one thing I wanted to say too, is really interesting. So you probably all read about Delta Airlines, right? That Delta, instead of adopting a mandatory vaccination policy, they implemented a surcharge for employees who aren't vaccinated, because the cost of, it sounded kind of cheap, the average cost of being hospitalized was $50,000, and that, they were paying enormous costs for unvaccinated employees. To my great surprise, I thought that wouldn't be a very effective way. They've increased their vaccination rate by 40% since they implemented the $200 surcharge. So that's just another thing to kind of think about. You got to work with a lawyer on that stuff, because it's tricky federal and state rules. But that's another, if you're not mandated by OSHA, by CMS as a federal contractor or whatever, you might want to think about, but you want your people to be vaccinated. That's another way to do it. So thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a good afternoon. And thanks again, Dr. McCoy and Penny, for being here.